Happy evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of the monthly talks being hosted by the Bengaluru Butterfly Club, also known as BBC. The Bengaluru Butterfly Club was founded 12 years ago in Jan 2011, and the four founding members, Ashok Sen Gupta, Rohit Girotra, Hanish KM, and Nitin Ravikantachari, had planned to start the butterfly counts in Bengaluru. And in March 2012, that is 2 years later, the first counts were done. And so this year, BBC has completed 10 years of counting butterflies. So the team of club members have been recording the number of butterflies found, the species found in different locations over a period of time, being done at regular intervals. BBC has also been conducting walks during these years when people could join and see and learn about butterflies and also participate in spotting the butterflies to add to the counts. You can see the numbers on the screen of the number of butterflies seen and counted over these 10 years, and also the number of species, the number of walks conducted, and the hours spent in the field. We've also had 5 butterfly festivals in the last 5 years, conducted in association with the Karnataka Forest Department. Our members have participated in different butterfly surveys and biodiversity marathons, and we've also conducted different workshops for people to participate in, learn about butterflies, and record and document them. Here you can see the journey and growth of BBC, or the Bengaluru Butterfly Club, over the years since its formation. It was started in January of 2011, as mentioned before, and in March 2012, the first count was taken at the JP Nagar Reserve Forest, or JPRF also as it's known, in Duras and Palia. And ever since, it's being done right up to today. The team of BBC members have been going there at regular intervals and collecting the data and recording the number of butterflies found in each of the parts of JPRF at different time intervals. And this data has been going into the records and being documented. This will also let us know over a period of time or over years as to the existence of these species, their numbers, the changes according to the seasons, etc. And in April 2012, we also had the first BBC field visit that happened outside Bangalore too. In November 2012, the number of butterflies that were counted were 10,000. And in December 2012 was a landmark where a butterfly called the lilac silver line, which was thought to be extinct, was rediscovered by one of the founding members, Nitin, and it is being documented too. In June 2014, we completed 100 butterfly walks that were conducted by the Bengaluru Butterfly Club. In Jan 2016, 50,000 butterflies had been counted. In June 2016, the Bengaluru Butterfly Club, in collaboration with the Forest Department, planted LHPs, or the larval host plants, in JPRF. These are the plants on which the butterflies lay their eggs and the caterpillars feed on those plants and they grow. So each of these species of butterflies have their specific own larval host plants, and they do not lay eggs or eat the other plants. So these plants were identified and they are being planted in the Duras and Palia campus. So this will also make the number of butterflies increase there, as they can lay eggs and reproduce and grow in the campus. In June 2017, we had the first butterfly festival being held jointly with the Karnataka Forest Department. And every year we've been having these, conducting these festivals since then. And we've had the 5th one that was held last year. In the past 2 years, we've also had online events and expert talks with different experts giving talks on different topics related to butterflies. We've also had both adults and children, including the school students, participating in these festivals and learning more about butterflies while getting an opportunity to express their knowledge and love for butterflies and nature. In these 10 years of counting, by these counts, we've also had 16 new species, which were not in the earlier historical records of butterflies found in Bengaluru. These have been added to the list of butterflies found in Bengaluru because of these counts. So you can see some of the butterflies that have been seen and documented by the members of the BBC. We can have a look at some more pictures. This was taken during the Butterfly and Bee Festival held in 2020. And this was during a walk and a photography workshop that was conducted by the Bengaluru Butterfly Club, which helped even photographers to know how to record and document and then these butterflies in a beautiful and best manner. We also had our teams participating in different surveys conducted at different reserves to look at the butterflies found there and recording and documenting them. This picture was taken at the Kali Tiger Reserve. Many school children also have participated and learned at the workshops and events conducted by the Bengaluru Butterfly Club. So now on to the monthly talk. Today is the second of the monthly talks being hosted by the Bengaluru Butterfly Club. These monthly talks are being organized with speakers not only from India, but from other places across the globe as well. Last month, we had a talk by Chowdhury Udyanga, who joined us from Sri Lanka. Sorry. I request all of you to please keep yourself muted and keep your videos off to help better streaming. Thank you. So these monthly talks are being organized with speakers not only from India, but from other places across the globe as well. And like I said, we had a talk by Chowdhury Udyanga, who joined us from Sri Lanka to give us a talk about the butterflies of Sri Lanka last month. So the video recording of this talk is also available on the Bengaluru Butterfly Club channel on YouTube for those of you who might have missed it or who would like to watch it again. So today, as I said, is the second of the monthly talks, and today's speaker is Shawan Chowdhury. It gives me great pleasure in introducing Shawan Chowdhury to all of you. He is finalizing his PhD at the School of Biological Sciences in the University of Queensland. As part of his PhD research, he is also working on insect migration and conservation with Professor Richard Fuller and Professor Myron Zaluki. Shawan has already passed his PhD defense with minor corrections and is now awaiting the final outcome. Based on PhD output, University of Queensland had selected 3 students for a prestigious fellowship, and Shawan was one of them. During his PhD, Shawan has completed 15 projects, of which 7 are published and 2 are in review, and the rest 6 are nearly ready to be submitted. Shawan soon will start his postdoc at the German Center for Integrated Biodiversity in Germany. Before arriving in Australia, Shawan completed his bachelor's and master's from the Department of Zoology, University of Dhaka. Even though he is enthusiastic about nature since his childhood, his interest in studying insect conservation started during his university days. During the field surveys, he noticed that some butterfly species were discreetly recorded in different parts of Bangladesh. Going through published studies, he learned about their fascinating migratory movements, which inspired Shawan to work on the ecology and conservation of migratory butterflies as a PhD project. So today we have Shawan sharing his experiences and observations with us. Welcome, Shawan, and thank you for being here and taking your time out. And you're almost close to midnight, I think, at your place. And thank you for taking that time and being here with all of us for the second of the monthly Connect talks conducted by BBC. And over to you, Shawan. I request all the audience to please keep yourself muted and keep your videos off to help better streaming. Thank you. Yes, over to you, Shawan.
Thanks, Priya, for the nice introduction. And thanks to the BBC for inviting me to present my work here. It's a great opportunity for me. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about my PhD research, which is on insect movement and conservation. And I'm finalizing my PhD at the School of Biological Sciences, University of Queensland, which Priya already mentioned earlier. So whenever we think about insects, some tiniest, creepiest creatures pop into our mind. I mean, to the most non-entomologist people. How extinct is biomass transfer during their migration? Well, recent studies have proved that every year trillions and trillions of insects take migratory flight, And during that migration, the biomass transfer is enormous. Recently, Hugh and his colleagues quantified the biomass flux just over the southern United Kingdom, and they found that every year about 3.5 trillions of insects take migratory flight, and during that flight, the biomass transfer is more than 3,000 tons. It is happening with the tiniest portion of the world. Just imagine what is happening in the entire world. We all are aware that vertebrates are thousands and thousands times heavier than insects. But during the migratory flight, sometimes the biomass transfer of insects is very close to or even larger than vertebrates. Somebody once wrote that the first approximation of the class Insecta, the first approximation of the animal kingdom is under the class Insecta, which alone contains more than 90% of the animal kingdom. And if we consider the whole group Arthropoda, then it will contain almost all the animal species in the world. In that sense, studying vertebrates will be trivial. But how many migratory species are we really aware of? So we oftentimes spot butterflies collecting nectar from one flower to another flower and thus help in pollination. And they oftentimes considered as an ecosystem indicator group because of their enormous impact on our ecosystem. And they oftentimes considered as a major food source for different groups, including amphibians, reptiles, and even spiders. Now, why should we study migration in butterflies? So when a butterfly actually crosses multiple regions, they face more threats than the resident species. And therefore, conserving them is actually a prime priority. So for example, everyone are aware of the iconic migration of monarch butterfly. And in the last few decades, their habitat along with their number actually sharply declined over the time period, which you can see from both of this figure. And this is happening with the most common migratory butterfly or most common butterfly in the world. Just imagine what is happening with the other hundreds of species of which we do not have sufficient idea about. Now, if someone is to work on butterfly migration or insect migration, they actually need to define it first, because with the term migration, we always think about two-way movement of the same individual that is happening throughout their lifetime. But this is not always the case for butterflies or different other insect groups. For example, it takes 3 to 5 generations for the monarch butterflies to complete their annual journey. And with the term migration, we also think that many individuals are flying in the same direction, which is happening for days, weeks, or even months. But this is mostly not the case for butterflies. I mean, for example, the blue tiger butterfly, which is very common in India, Bangladesh, on those areas, and even Australia. So they sometimes actually fly like 3-4 individuals, but it actually happens for several hours or even days. And so in a general sense, we don't really consider that as migration. However, they in fact are migrating because they're actually going to the same direction, and it is happening throughout the time. For this, defining butterfly migration is quite difficult, and the most popular definition was given by Kennedy in 1985. So according to him, any individual can be migratory if there are available vehicles. So in that sense, migration seems pretty akin to dispersal, congregation, or aggregation. So how should we differentiate migration with other movement behavior? Well, migratory butterflies do not get distracted by appetitive cues that includes attraction towards opposite sex or collecting nectar or any such behavior. So here in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about 5 of my PhD chapters. So first, I'll talk about the overall migration in butterflies, how widespread it is, and yeah. And the second PhD chapter, I'll talk about the seasonal switching of butterfly migration and how it varies globally. In my third PhD chapter, I'll talk about, I'll talk about the range expansion of the tawny coastal butterfly, which everyone knows about because it can be found in India, Bangladesh, and even Australia. In the fourth chapter, I actually worked on the protected area performance for butterflies in Bangladesh. And in my final chapter, I actually worked on how the protected areas are performing in insects globally. So in my first page chapter, I worked on the migration in butterflies. So here was aimed to find out, I was aimed to summarize previous works to find out how widespread is migration in butterflies, how studying butterfly migration has changed over the time period, and to identify the knowledge gaps. For this, I used a set of keywords and used different search system to find relevant literature. And I also went through the reference section of each paper to make it more comprehensive. When going through the reference section, I found that many people actually publish their work in local journals. So I also selected some local journals like the Journal of the Bombay Naturalist Society, of the Bulletin of the Allen Museum. And I went through all the issues of these journals to make the review more comprehensive. So this figure is showing the progress of studying butterfly migration. So recording butterfly migration actually started about 15th century. However, following our literature search, I found the first one by Darwin in 1833 when he was continuing his famous journey in Beagle. It was actually in 1831, I think. And Thaxter was the first person to describe or to discover the overwintering site of monarch butterflies, but it was not consistent, and it took about 100 years to find out the overwintering site in North America. By Arkworth was working for about 38 years. So the most interesting works or advanced work on butterfly migration actually started on early 1960s by Johnson, who actually described the physiological evidence of migratory butterflies, that the migratory butterflies actually develop earlier than the non-migratory butterflies. And this is also called the oogenesis syndrome. So the radar work started at the end of the 1970s when but it actually took like several decades for the radar to actually imply it for detecting insect migration. And later, Watson and Hobson discussed the isotopic evidence. This is a really cool study. So when a butterfly actually travel from one place to another, they actually, the isotopic component of that particular environment gets attached to their wings. So by examining like a tiniest part of the forewing, you can find out from which part of the world that particular individual is from. But you need to have a very good soil map for that. And finally, Morrison and Frost described the flight simulator. Although there was like a flight simulator was used for other insects, but not on migratory butterflies. So in this flight simulator, they actually attach the butterflies with the cable, and the direction of the migratory flight is actually similar to their direction when they take the migratory flight. And the migratory individual actually flies longer than the non-migratory individuals. So overall, in this review, I found 568 species to show migratory movement. So I obtained the most migratory butterflies from the Nymphalidae family, and the least was from Rhodonidae family. However, considering the number of species in that particular family, the highest proportion was from Pieridae. Interestingly, there was 23 species of butterflies which were described both as migratory and non-migratory in different parts of the world. This is a very interesting phenomenon for butterflies because in the same cluster, there can be both migratory and non-migratory individuals. For example, Van der Janden 2018 actually discussed this behavior. They collected 33 individuals from the southern Florida, I think, and they did the isotopic experiment, and they found that 48% of the butterflies are actually from different parts of USA, and the other 52% are the resident. So this map is showing the global record of butterfly migration. So this is actually a very biased map because I collected the record from previously published studies and calculated the proportion of migratory individual for that particular region. As you can see, I mean, as you all know that most researchers on butterfly migration are actually from the Europe and North America. So most migratory butterflies are actually from these regions because they recorded their migratory movement. And the migratory butterflies are recorded from all over the world, which you can clearly see from this figure, but not from Antarctica because they cannot tolerate that extreme temperature. I obtained substantial differences between the proportion of migratory butterflies along different geographic regions. For example, if you consider the pyridae, then 66% of the pyridae of the Palearctic region, which is at the top right corner, are migratory, whereas about 9% of the pirid butterflies from the neotropical region are the migratory. So how biased this map we can clearly find out from the next figure. So in this one, I only considered English to find out the relevant literature, but here I extended this review using different other languages, for example, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and Spanish. And I found an additional 447 studies, I think, from different parts of the world. And there are records of butterfly migration in other parts of the world, especially in South America and eastern part of Asia, but they mostly publish their work in non-English languages or in their own languages. So when people usually search in English, they cannot really find those studies. And in this review, I found 14 studies that previous authors used to record butterfly migration or describe the migratory status of the species. I broadly grouped these 14 methods in 3 categories: the physiological, observation, and the population evidence one. As you can see from this Venn diagram that for all the butterfly families, the population evidence was the most popular. I mean, this is quite obvious because in most studies, authors just described their migratory movement, like they spotted some migratory flight and they published that study. And there are very few studies on physiological and the observation evidence one. So this figure is telling that there is still a lot to work on migratory butterflies because most of the works are only focused on 3 most popular species like monarch, painted lady, and the red admiral butterfly. And our current knowledge on other species is very limited. In my second PhD chapter, I worked on how the seasonal switching in migratory butterflies differ globally. And I developed the ecological niche model for each species, and I aggregated those models to find out the global pattern. And finally, I calculated their extinction risk based on the magnitude of seasonal fluctuation and range size. So I'm not going to bore you with these details, but if anyone is keen to know more about the method, I can come to this later. So here I obtained about 14 million geospatial records for all the migratory butterflies. Oh, I actually obtained the list of migratory butterflies from my first PhD chapter, and then I downloaded the occurrence record from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is an open database, and anyone can use that. And finally, I actually grouped the entire world into 11 ecoregions and the entire year into 4 seasons. So the thing is, when I developed the model by considering the entire world, it was actually highly biased. So I found some literature and they suggested that when developing the model in relatively smaller regions, then it actually performs better. So when a species was distributed in all seasons and in all over the world, there are about 44 models for each species. So overall, the degree of seasonal switching was very high for all the migratory butterflies, and it was quite common for all the major butterfly families. And for about more than 75% of species, about 85% of pixels are migratory. And for about 85% of species, more than 96% pixels are migratory. And there are substantial differences between migratory and the non-migratory individuals. This map is showing the global distribution of seasonal switching in habitat suitability for migratory butterflies. So here I calculate the seasonal switching by comparing the seasonal distribution for each species. So for example, I converted each model into binary, and when I merged all these values, so there are 4 models for each species globally. So the value could range between 0 to 5, 0 to 4. When here 0 means that the pixel was never suitable for their species, and 4 means the pixel was always suitable for their species, which means there was no seasonal switching. But when the values are in between, it means that the pixel was suitable for that particular migratory butterfly in one season and was unsuitable in another season, which is indicating the seasonal switching for the migratory butterflies. So here, we all know that for most of the migratory species, the proportion of migratory species are actually higher in higher latitude and lower in lower latitude. However, we can clearly see from this figure that the seasonal switching in migratory butterfly is actually higher in lower latitude, like the Panamanian or some parts of the Oriental region and the near tropical region, and it was lower in the higher latitude, like the Nearctic or the Palearctic. So this result is quite similar to the migration pattern of the land mammals. So as I said earlier that I calculated the extinction risk for the migratory butterflies. So according to IUCN, when the minimum range size and the maximum range size proportion is more than 10-fold, then those species are actually more prone to extinction. So here about 13% species are actually in that category. And these red dots are showing that the fluctuation was more than 10, and the blue dots are showing that fluctuation was less than 10. And more extremely, there are like 7 species for which the fluctuation exceeded 100-fold. And the second figure is showing the seasonal distribution of migratory butterflies for which are more prone to extinction. And as you can see that this one is very similar to their overall seasonal switching, that the proportion of species are higher in lower latitude and lower in high latitude. So we everyone know about the tawny coastal butterfly, which is very common in India, Bangladesh, and other parts of South Asia. And in the last few decades, this butterfly has expanded rapidly throughout the Southeast Asia and eventually entered into Australia in 2012. I think it was in April or May 2012. And after entering Australia, this species is undergoing rapid range expansion. So here I calculated the rate of geographic range expansion for this species, and I assessed whether there is any niche shift or whether they're maintaining their same native niche. For this, I grouped the geographic distribution in 3 parts: the pre-expansion, early expansion, and the late expansion region. And I developed the ecological niche model in different parts of the distribution. I also did the niche overlapping analysis to find out whether they're maintaining the niche or not. So in the first figure of the box, you can see that there are 3 geographic ranges: the pre, early, and the late expansion region. And the red dots are actually showing the distribution records for this species. So here I collected the distribution record from the published resource from GBIF and also from different Facebook groups. So as you can see from the other 3 maps, the red ones, that only the last one, which is by considering all the records of this distribution, actually predicted the distribution of this species better than the other model. So we thought that there might be some niche shift, especially in the Southeast Asian distribution. So we actually ran the PCA and other niche overlapping analysis. Interestingly found that the niche of the early and late expansion region is actually nested within the pre-expansion region, which is the blue dots. Yeah. And this species is actually maintaining the same niche following the distribution in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. So as I said earlier that this particular butterfly is actually expanding rapidly in Australia after their establishment, which you can clearly see from the range polygons. So they actually first arrived in Darwin in 2012, and after that they started moving towards west or southwest part, and they eventually reached Kimberley in 2015, which is their most extreme distribution. And afterwards they started expanding their range towards Queensland. And there was a paper by Field in 2017. They said that there was a huge storm at that time in Australia, which actually helped this butterfly to expand in towards this direction. However, there was no solid proof of that, so I don't really know what actually triggered that sudden movement. So I calculated their range expansion in two different ways, and I found that tawny coastal butterfly is expanding in Australia at about 135 kilometer per year. But the range expansion rate was actually very high when they first arrived Australia, because the distribution suitability in the Northern Territory or Western Australia is not actually quite similar to Queensland, because considering their pre-expansion distribution. So there are breeding records of this butterfly in different parts of Australia. Like there are probably 38 breeding records, which are mostly distributed in Darwin, Cairns, and Townsville. Yeah, and as you can see from the second figure, which is showing the migration record for downy coastal butterfly, and we can see that the direction of the migration is actually similar to the direction of the range expansion, like we can see it from this figure. And so we hypothesized that the probably migration is actually associated with the range expansion of this butterfly. So interestingly, most of the migration record for tawny coastal butterfly only considered the female individuals, and there was no male individuals. And it was probably the first documentation of sex biased. I mean, all the individuals are female migration in butterflies. I mean, according to our literature search. So in the fourth chapter, I worked how the protected areas in Bangladesh are performing in conserving butterflies. And because in South Asia, the proportion of protected area coverage is relatively low in other parts of the world. For example, only about 4.61% of geographic land in Bangladesh is considered as protected area. And it was less than 6% for India, I think. So I thought it would be interesting to find out what is the status of those protected areas, because in most cases for the developing countries, they actually establish or listed the land which doesn't have that much economic benefits in most cases, but not all the cases. So here I followed a set of approaches to find out the performance of protected areas in Bangladesh. So I collected the species list, and there are about 305 species from the IUCN Bangladesh. And I collected their occurrence record first from the GB. And as you can see that there are only 205 records for 305 species. So this is clearly an under representation of those butterflies. So afterwards, I georeferenced the Facebook records, and where I obtained more than 7,000 records. And finally, I added my personal observation records to make it more comprehensive. And here the green areas are actually showing the distribution of protected areas in Bangladesh, which is very biased, mostly consists of Sundarbans. So I developed the habitat suitability map and also the range polygon in two different ways, the convexal and the alpha. And I overlaid this range polygon with the distribution of protected area to find out the extent to which the current protected areas in Bangladesh cover the geographic distribution of butterflies. So these figures are the first three figures are showing the suitability distribution of Bangladeshi butterflies. As you can see that the first one, which is for all the butterflies, and the third one, which is for the threatened species, is quite similar, that the suitability was very high in the northeast, east, and southeast part of the country, and also the center part, and it was very low in other parts of the country. However, for the non-threatened species, the suitability peaked in the center part of the country. And obviously, like as you can see from the figure E, that there are many records of these butterflies from these areas. So maybe it's the biased distribution was actually had some impact on the estimation. So our protected area overlap analysis, or the gap analysis, actually showed that the protected areas in Bangladesh are actually not performing very well in conserving the geographic range of Bangladeshi butterflies. So as you can see here, that the overall protected area coverage is very low in all the categories, and less than 1.5% of geographic range of Bangladeshi butterflies is actually within the protected areas. And for example, using the suitability map or the ecological niche model approach, the coverage was lowest, and there was like 62 species for which there was no protected area coverage, which is also known the gap species. From the box plot, we can see that the protected area coverage was slightly higher for the threatened species than the non-threatened species. It was really interesting because there are some threatened butterflies in Bangladesh which are distributed mostly in the south and southwest part of the country, and there are Sundarbans, which is considered as the protected area. So the coverage was relatively higher for species which are distributed in those areas. So in my final PhD chapter, I worked on the insect conservation status in protected areas globally. And yeah, the analysis was kind of similar than the previous one. So whenever we think about protected areas, we think about vertebrates. Like if we go through all the large scale conservation studies, there are very few studies on insects globally. And if we talk about insect conservation, so scientists rarely actually discuss the importance of protected areas. I don't really know why. So here I thought that it would be really interesting to do a review on this topic to make our case more important. So here I found about 1516 studies on protected areas and insects. So the first one is showing the regional bias of the published studies. As you can see that except for Brazil, South Africa, and India, the studies are mostly focused on the developed part of the world, and there are very few studies from the developing countries. And from the figure B, we can see that most studies are obviously on the most popular group or the most spacious group of insects. And surprisingly, most studies on insects and protected areas are actually on distribution. I mean, for example, some researchers surveyed a particular protected area, like how many species of insects they found from that area, and they published the study. And there are very few studies on the protected area performance or the conservation assessment one, which we can clearly see from the figure. And except for Europe and obviously North America, most studies on other parts of the world are actually on distribution. So for this one, I actually downloaded the species distribution record from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and there are more than 107 million records. And I collected the protected area data set from the World Database of Protected Area, and I developed the range polygon in two different ways, the convex hull and the alpha hull. And I did it at 1 kilometer square resolution globally. It was like a huge analysis, and it took more than a year using the high performance computer. And finally, I calculated the representation target. So this figure is on the phylogenetic tree showing the percentage of species meeting their protection target. Overall, the mean coverage for insect species was about 19.24%, which is a bit higher than the current terrestrial protected area coverage. However, there are like 3 in 4 insect species for which the target representation didn't meet. And it was quite true for all the insect orders. So as you can see the pie charts outside the phylogenetic tree, here the blue areas are indicating the species not meeting the representation target, and the orange or the yellow ones, the orange ones, yeah, are representing the species for which, oh, I was actually wrong. The species for which the target didn't meet, and the blue ones are for which the target met. And for most of the species, the representation target was way below that they required to be. For example, according to the method developed by Rodriguez, the species for which the geographic range is more than 250,000 kilometers square, it should be similar amount of the protected area coverage. And for species with less than 1,000 kilometers square, that coverage should be about 100%, and there should be like log linear interpolation wave for the other species. So the percentages of species for which the target representation didn't meet are actually distributed all over the world, which you can clearly see from this figure. And for most of the species for which the target representation didn't meet are actually distributed in most part of the North America. Mostly because the current protected area coverage is relatively low in North America, and it was quite higher in the other tropical parts of the world. So there is another point. It might be because when people from the developed world actually goes to these areas, they only survey the protected areas. So most of the records for insect distribution are actually from these areas. So whenever someone is doing the gap analysis with species with restricted distribution, so it will indicate that the entire range of that species is actually within protected areas, which is a good thing, but not a good thing in another sense, because we don't really know the proper distribution of that species. And the species the outside this map are some representative species, which are different IUCN categories. So what should we do to conserve insects globally, or butterflies? We actually need to follow a set of approaches, which we discussed in our review, which is now under review in tree. And like more communication around the plight of insect is required. So for example, how different anthropogenic stressors like pesticide use or the global warming or deforestation are actually impacting insects globally. I mean, for example, if we go through the published resources, then we can find out that most studies on insect decline are actually from the developed world, and we don't really know much about the insects of other parts of the world. And then the current distribution of insect is highly biased. So for example, if you consider distribution of insects in the Atlas of Living Australia, about 62% of the records are for vertebrates, whereas like less than 5% are on insects, I think. So more studies on this is required globally, where the citizen science definitely can impact enormously, which Priya described earlier. Like there are more than 100,000 record for those species, and it was happened just by the BBC. And third, there are very few protected areas in the world which are designated just only considering the distribution of insect or prioritizing insects. So more protected areas are actually required to established in different parts of the world, considering the distribution of insects, where the systematic conservation planning approach or the spatial prioritization can have a very substantial impact. And here people can actually prioritize the native species, because the invasive species or the exotic species might have severe severe negative impact on the native species. And finally, we need to have strong policy in place, especially to prioritize insect conservation beyond the protected area fence, because the protected areas cannot be like 100% of the country, but all the species are actually distributed all over the country or the world. So when the species are actually distributed in other parts of the protected area, we also need to ensure their conservation in those areas if we really want to conserve insects. Fine. Thankful to both of my supervisors for their enormous impact throughout my PhD. And I also thankful to the Austrian government for providing the PhD scholarship. And that's all, everyone. Thanks for listening. Yep. I would love to hear some questions. Should I stop sharing?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, you can stop sharing, Shawan.
Yep.
We have got some good set of questions.
Yes. So there are some questions from the audience to Shawan.
Yeah.
The first one, what was the reason or why is it that only majority of the females migrate? Case in point on one of the slides.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, but I don't really know why it happens because, I mean, one of the co-authors of that study, Michael Brabby, who actually spotted those female biased migration, mostly in the northern part of Queensland. But I didn't investigate why it happens. So if I want to, yeah. So I don't really have enough idea on that. Sorry about that.
Yeah, the next question is why do only some species migrate while others don't?
It was also a hypothetical question. So I would say like there are certain regions. I mean, for example, for dispersal, it might be because there are some threat or any kind of disturbance in that particular habitat. But for migration, it might be because of their innate behavior, like from their earlier generation. And it also might indicate the understudy of that group. I mean, for example, before starting my PhD, I didn't even know about the definition of butterfly migration. And I didn't know that that many butterflies can be migratory. So it might be interesting to extend that study towards other species to find out whether other species really migrate or not. So I don't think anyone actually can say that one species is a non-migrant.
Okay. The third question, there are different types of butterfly movements like population dispersion, altitude migration, and seasonal movements. What are the different categories of migration as per experts?
So if you consider insect migration, and I don't think there is any such categories because like if you consider like the bird migration, then there are like altitudinal migration, partial migration, or other type of migration. But for insects, it mostly like how they're moving from one place to another. Like for example, if a butterfly actually moves certain times and they do not migrate in other year or so, then it will be called like partial migration for birds or the nomadic movement. But for insects, it can be considered migration. So when we are going to categorize the migration for insects, it might be a bit problematic. But my knowledge on this is very limited.
Okay, thank you. The next question, is there any study on how migration pattern is changing based on climate change?
No, I don't think so. There is no global study on that.
Okay.
But there are some studies by Roger Dennis, I think, and they studied the migratory moth, I think, from the Great Britain, and they found that because of the climate change, the population number of the migratory individuals, I mean, that moths are actually increasing.
Okay. Is it that change in climate has affected their movements?
Well, again, the studies on how different anthropogenic impacts are actually, anthropogenic stressors are impacting the migratory species are very limited studies, and most of the studies are focused on painted lady and the monarch butterflies. And they found that there is substantial impact of climate change on monarch butterfly. For example, there might be changes in the wing feature. So there are some studies like Altiger and Davis 2010, I think, who described that the migratory individuals actually has longer furrowing than the non-migratory individuals. So because of the climate change, the wing size can actually reduce, which is a very common phenomenon in different other groups like birds. So if it happens, then it might indicate that the migratory butterflies are actually becoming resident. And there was a recent study in the PNAS by Hudingle group from the UC Davis, and they found that the size of the monarch butterflies is actually has declined over time.
Wow. Okay. How can we use their movements as ecological indicator?
I think I would love to hear some more explanation of that question.
Nothing. Okay, we will get back to this. The next question is, any serious impact of climate change on migration observed so far? I think they're similar questions.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the next question. Have you looked at
I
or
think,
observed?
Priya,
Yeah.
1 second. I think what the question means is that can we derive any kind of indication based on these movements, whether the ecological factor is being improved or like degrading? I think that is what the question is targeted at. Say, for
Yeah.
example, based on the movements, can we derive at an answer whether the overall ecological factor is improving or degrading?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So in the last few days, I was actually thinking about doing a review on migratory connectivity for insect migration. And if you consider the other migratory group and like the stop habitat, I mean, yeah, the migratory connectivity actually plays a very important role in conserving those species. Like if the habitat quality degrades, then it actually impacts the migratory species. For example, if a species is going from A to B, but they're actually stopping in C in the middle. So if the habitat actually declined or the condition actually gets worse, then it might be very problematic for that species. But we don't really know much about the global annual movement of most of the migratory butterflies. So it would be really interesting to do a study on that, like how habitat fragmentation in the stopover sites actually impacting the migratory species. And we can also test this by like as I discussed in my presentation that Hugh 2016 quantified the biomass flux over the southern United Kingdom, and they found that over 3,000 tons of biomass transfer actually happens annually. And when we can actually compare the biomass transfer in different parts of the world over time, which we can find out what is happening and whether there is any change in the habitat or the environmental quality of that particular habitat. Did I answer the question?
Okay, sure.
Did I answer the question?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute.
No, it's fine.
Okay, the next question is, have you looked at or observed reproductive diapause association with life history traits such as flight morphology and lifespan?
No, I didn't work on that. Like most of my work are on with the secondary data. Like I focused on quantitative ecology.
Okay. The next question is, what is the method?
There are some papers by Kuntesar's lab, I think, on this.
Okay. The next question is, what is the method used, or is there a method to track specific butterfly? Like how it is done in the birds using tags, rings, tracking chips, etc.
Well, you can use like paper tag for this for migratory butterflies. Like many people in East Asia and in Canada and also in the US are actually using this method to find out. But the thing is, the chances of getting the same individual is very low. And it used to be very popular in the early days of butterfly migration study. For example, Arkuhat, I don't really know how to pronounce his name. So they did the tag recapture study for about 38 years, and they found the overwintering site, and they used to follow that method. But in the later, in like 1986, they found that the species obtaining the later part was very low, and so they actually didn't follow the similar time of marking. But you can follow other types of things, like for example, if you do the isotopic experiment, then you can find out in which part of the world that butterfly species is from. And there was an interesting study by Malcolm in 1989, and they did the uh, cardinolite sequestration, and they found that, I mean, for example, if you compare the plant quality of one species from one place to another place, so there will be some differences in their composition of the nectar. So you can actually uh, the compare that with their species. And there is another interesting study by Shuchan in 2018, I think. So they actually did the pollen metabarcoding of the painted lady butterfly, and they found the origin of their species based on the pollen deposited in their gut, I think, most probably.
Wow, that's very interesting, Shawan.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a very interesting study.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody would love to know how the data was compiled from FB.
Oh, we actually discussed the method in details in that paper, but to like summarize, I obtained the species information from the IUCN Red List data book, and I mean, not I, we we searched for each species in that Facebook group. Like if you go to Facebook, then there is a search bar, and if you search for that particular species, there will be all records for this species who posted earlier. But the problem with this is in many cases, the identification is not correct, or there was no specific information about the location information. So we actually skipped those records. For other species or for other photographic records, we actually collected the distribution records. I mean, for example, the date and the location, and also the photographer details. And then we georeferenced it using the Google Earth or the Google Map. It's a quite complex process, but it's very helpful.
Yeah, because going through all the data in Facebook is like too time consuming and very difficult to manage it, right?
Yeah.
I heard there are some extractors, but I'm not sure what they are. But
There are some R packages or Python packages to do that, but the
correct.
problem is Facebook actually changed the API all the time, so you cannot really do
Yeah,
it in a consistent
yeah.
way.
Within 24 hours, Facebook changes a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
But
true.
if someone actually can develop an app that all the records from Facebook will be deposited into iNaturalist, then it will be a great contribution to conservation, I think. Because like if we go through the or available records of biodiversity from South Asia, then it is really frustrating that no one actually using iNaturalist.
Yes, anybody else would want to ask a question, then please do raise your hands and we'll unmute you.
Yeah, Jesse, go on.
Hello, I was wondering, can you let people know what iNaturalist is, please?
Oh, yeah, definitely. But you can discuss it better, I think. Uh, Okay, iNaturalist is a citizen science app where you can post your photo. I mean, for example, even when you don't really know about the identification of that species. For example, you are taking a random insect photo and you don't really know the name, you can actually post it in iNaturalist, and it's very simple. You can use it with your Android or the iPhone. And when an expert will actually provide the identification of that species, and it will be verified, and then it will be deposited in the world record. And it's very simple to use, and I would recommend for everyone, especially the researchers, to use this app, because it is really important to uh, find out which species are distributed in which parts of the world to uh, do the better conservation planning globally.
Thank you.
No problem. Vijay is there as well.
Yeah, Vijay.
Just to add a little bit to what you said about iNaturalist, I think that is the quickest way for a citizen scientist to get the data to GBIF, because all the research grade records from iNaturalist go and sit on GBIF, which I was observing almost every study you were describing today started with, okay, I started with this data set from GBIF and then I added A, B, or C. So that's kind of taking our data to GBIF and depositing it there is very important. And iNaturalist is one of the quickest way to for citizen scientists to make sure that it is there. It's also a fantastic way to maintain personal records, your life list, your when and where you have seen each species, and it's a great learning tool to learn about any biodiversity. So yeah, that's what I just wanted to add.
You need to develop another package like RGBIF, like how people can extract biodiversity data from Facebook. It will be interesting.
We are working on that, but unfortunately, Facebook changes their policy every month, and that is never going to happen. So I think our best bet is to educate all the people on Facebook to use something like iNaturalist when they're posting. So in some of the groups now, what we have made as a policy is saying you should first go and post it on iNaturalist and post the link on Facebook, then only we will help you identify. So I mean, experts start doing that, then everyone will go and post it on iNaturalist.
That's a great idea.
Is there any other
Yes.
question? Anyone else have any other questions?
And please raise your hands.
I think that's it. Priya.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. The migration tracking in North America, they use this paper stickers that 3M has developed in association with Monarch Watch, which kind of stay on monarchs for forever, but it doesn't seem to be hindering their migration ability, because every year they find at least a few hundred monarchs which were tagged from anywhere in US, went all the way to Mexico and returned with the sticker still intact. So that's one of the ways. But as you rightly said, you need a lot of people observing or collecting or looking for butterflies in those regions, then only it will work.
Yeah. And monarch is actually an exception of, I mean, yeah, like atypical migratory butterfly. It's actually quite large than the other species.
Mm-hmm.
But still, with that paper sticker, you will get only start and end point, right, Shawan and Vijay? We don't get the majority of the, I mean, data points, like at what altitude they are flying, what kind of current they are facing, and a lot of other stuff that are critical for the survival during the migration, right? So those things are not really being tracked. That's, I mean, only you can do so much stuff in a small body, right?
Yeah, maybe someone will start working on like Icarus, which Martin Wilkop is doing in the, Germany.
Actually, we
Martin
tried
Wilkes,
that.
sorry.
Yeah, actually we tried that with monarchs, that little radio tag with a battery, and the monarch could actually fly about 10 miles with that. Yeah, Mark, the team from Germany was in Lawrence, Kansas, and at Monarch Watch we did this experiments. It was really interesting, but the next problem is the batteries won't last long. If the kind of batteries we can use that Monarch can carry won't last that long. So, tracking back that Monarch was pretty difficult. So we actually rented a small airplane and we kind of went around looking for it, and we found it 10 miles north of where we released it by the end of the day. So it is there, but it's going to be extremely difficult for that small insect to put any kind of code on that.
This seems to be more an engineering problem than a biological problem.
Hello, Vijay. Ashok here.
Yes.
So it's we are waiting for the nanotechnology to take over the study of migration. Yeah, that's what has to be done, because we have been observing butterflies migration in South India, and a lot of people are working on this regard. But still, a lot of things has to be figured out. You know, butterflies, they often change their path, so they are not following the same path for migration. And what is the reason for the change of the path? So that has to be figured out. Maybe there are some microhabitat issues, or maybe some environmental degradation issues. Those things has to be figured out, and it's not only the naturalist can do it. We require serious people to work on that.
Yeah, exactly. Like what's happening in their migratory pathway.
Yeah. It's still a lot of miles to go. It's not, we are just a beginning. You know, monarchs have been studying extensively, and they know they have figured out a lot of things. And the similar things is happening is in South India. It's a ritual is happening, but some of the years the migration is almost zero, and some of the year they're massive. And we have not known the reasons behind this massive migration and this drop in the migration. And this year there was no migration, almost nothing.
Yeah.
So
there can be another situation, like for example, something like this happened in Brisbane a couple of years ago for blue tiger butterflies. So they do not really migrate in mass individual or mass movement all the time. Like for example, they might be like one individual is actually passing through in the same direction for several days, but when we're actually watching that, we don't really pay heed on that behavior because we always think about the massive movement during the migratory flight. But sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah. But I think in 2019, like there are like thousands and thousands of blue tiger butterflies all over Brisbane, because they used to migrate like one individuals or a couple of individuals. But in that year, they migrated like a huge number of individuals. Yeah. My brain is not working.
Yes, so
okay. So thank you, Shawan, so for the accepting our invitation. This is Hanish.
Oh, hi, Anish.
Yeah, so,
thanks a lot for the invitation. It
yeah,
means a
so
lot.
it is almost midnight there. So thank you for the sharing your knowledge. So your
work
and the research work. So thank you so much. So this session will be available in the YouTube, so we can share to more people also.
Okay, yeah,
so
that would be really.
Priya.
Sorry. Yeah. Oh, Jesse was about to add something about the citizen science work in Asia, I think. But I'm not sure who.
I was just going to share, there's actually a lot going on globally around butterflies in particular. Like in Europe, they're doing a lot on painted ladies, for example. So you could look into that. But I think in terms of using iNaturalist, it's a really, really good idea because it also helps the community learn from each other, as well as the AI, artificial intelligence, supporting identification. And the problem with trying to scrape things off of Facebook is that you don't automatically have location data, which is super, super critical when you're looking at the movement of these different species. So I agree with who said to always just have it put automatically into iNaturalist, encourage people to post the links to their iNaturalist accounts to share what they've seen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So
Also,
thank you.
Facebook has the issue that people try to beautify the photos and probably change the color and shade and all that. So
Yes, so thank you again, Shawan, for your wonderful presentation and talk, and for answering all the questions of the viewers and participants, and for giving us such interesting facts and data about butterfly migration. And it's also allowed us to learn ways of moving towards better conservation methods and better management actions. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, experience, observations, and studies with us. Thank you so much, and for taking your time. I like Kani said, you're past midnight there, I think, for being here with us in spite of your time, and helping us learn a whole lot more. Thank you so much.
No, thanks everyone for the invitation. It really means a lot. Like, yeah. And if anyone has any more question, please reach out and I'd be happy to answer in details.
Yeah. And before we wind up, I also would like to let all the viewers know that you can follow us on various platforms of BBC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and get to know about the future talks and events. So looking forward to all of you also joining us for the next talk, as well as all the other future ones. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Shawan.